Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The impossible crime. It was on a pale November morning, when the yellow fog still clung to the narrow eaves of Baker Street like a reluctant guest, that the mystery made its peculiar entrance into our lives. I had been reading the Times, its damp edges curling against the chill that permeated our sitting room, while Holmes stood by the hearth, pipe in hand, his gaze fixed on the orange peel curling in the ashtray, no doubt attempting to deduce the grocery habits of Mrs. Hudson. The knock came with an urgency not typically reserved for parcels. "Enter," Holmes called, without turning. A footman stepped in, his red liveried coat somewhat disheveled, and his youthful face pale with an emotion I could not at once identify: dread, or perhaps confusion. "A delivery, sir," he said, eyes flickering toward the object in his hands. It was an ordinary hatbox, leather-bound, well-worn, and fastened with brass clasps. There was no tag, no note, no label of any sort, left at the servants' entrance of the Countess's residence in Wimpole Street. The footman continued. "No one saw who brought it. The porter said it appeared there at precisely 6 o'clock this morning, just before the household rose. And you brought it here rather than to the police?" I asked, puzzled. "Per the Countess's instructions," she insisted. "Said if it was strange, it belonged to Mr. Holmes." Holmes took the box, set it on the table, and examined it with a curious lack of ceremony. His eyes narrowed. He sniffed it, then ran a slender finger along the clasp, wiping up a faint residue of dust. "Interesting," he murmured. He opened it. I confess that even now, the image makes my stomach lurch. Nestled within the velvet-lined interior, where once might have sat a gentleman's hat or fine gloves, was a collection of human teeth, dozens of them, molars and yellowed and cracked, some still tinged with the unmistakable trace of dried blood. They were arranged meticulously in concentric circles, like coins in a collector's case. One, I noted with horror, had a golden crown. There was no note, no explanation, only the teeth. The footman turned away, audibly retching into his sleeve. Holmes, in contrast, stood motionless. Then he gently removed a pair of tweezers from the table drawer, lifting one of the teeth and examining its root. "Extracted post-mortem," he muttered, with skill. "A dentist's hand, but hurried. Recently removed, no more than 24 hours old." "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed. "What sort of lunatic sends a box like this to a countess?" Holmes said nothing for a long while, merely staring into the box, as if it might rearrange itself into something coherent. "I presume," he said at last, "that the Countess did not recognize any of these?" "No, sir," the footman replied hoarsely. She's beside herself, naturally. Who wouldn't be, after receiving the contents of a charnel house as morning correspondence?" I said, still feeling queasy. Holmes tapped his chin. "There's something familiar here, but it eludes me. What's on? Do you see this one?" He lifted a single incisor, unusually large, its root jagged. "That is not a human tooth. An animal." "Hardly. It's ivory. A prosthetic. 19th century craftsmanship, likely fitted to a gentleman of considerable means. But the others, human, all from different mouths, if I'm not mistaken." He closed the box gently, as if it were a coffin. "Mr. Ashby," Holmes turned to the footman, "return to Wimpole Street and instruct the Countess not to open any future parcels without notifying me first, no matter how benign they appear, and tell her gently that this box may well be the beginning of something elaborate." "Yes, Mr. Holmes." Ashby bowed and hurried out, eager to be away from the grotesque cargo. When we were alone, Holmes sat, steepled his fingers, and stared at the box. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. He did not answer at once. "Watson, if I told you that this box was meant not to terrify, but to communicate, what would you say?" "I would say the sender has a vile sense of grammar." Holmes smiled faintly. And yet, I suspect this box is a message, or part of one, a cipher of sorts, each tooth, a symbol, a pattern, a challenge, perhaps. He stood suddenly, pacing. A woman of noble birth receives a box of disembodied teeth, human, animal, and artificial, each pulled with care, each placed with intention. There is no blood, no threat, no demand, only silence. That, Watson, is the most chilling part. And what do you intend to do? Holmes turned to the window, his eyes narrowing against the fog outside. I intend to listen to what the teeth are trying to say. Chapter 2. A strange client and stranger theory remained seated by the window for some time after the footman departed, his eyes distant, pipe forgotten between his fingers, tendrils of smoke curling upward like questions that refused to dissipate. I watched him for several minutes, noting the peculiar stillness in his limbs. When Holmes was silent, he was either deeply reflective or gravely troubled. I dared not interrupt. At last he spoke, though not to me. A hatbox of human teeth, he said, as if the phrase had been spoken aloud by the fog itself. Delivered anonymously. No note, no clear victim, no crime, not yet. But it is a crime, Watson. Of that I am certain. The kind that begins not with blood, but with curiosity. He stood and crossed to the fireplace, stoking the embers with sudden urgency. A criminal mind is forming something ... deliberate and theatrical. This was not done in rage. It was composed, orchestrated, and yet we have no theme to recognize. At that moment, the bell downstairs rang sharply, followed by brisk footsteps on the stairs. Holmes's brows lifted a fraction. Punctual, he muttered. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson opened the door with an air of strained dignity. Countess Elżbieta Chernin, she announced. Stepping aside, into the room swept a tall, statuesque woman, not young, but striking, with hair the color of snow, twisted into a high chignon. Her eyes were steel-gray, sharp and searching, and though impeccably dressed in mourning black, she carried herself with the military grace of a woman who had seen far more than drawing-rooms and dinner parties. Holmes bowed, gesturing to the armchair nearest the hearth. Countess, thank you for coming. I had no choice, she said in lightly accented English. You received the box? We did, Holmes replied. My sympathies, madam. Its contents were unsettling. The Countess sat without invitation, adjusting her gloves with gloved hands. I am not a woman easily unsettled, Mr. Holmes. I have seen death. In Poland, in Vienna, in war, but never have I seen this. Then you had no suspicion of who might have sent it? I asked gently. She looked at me then, her eyes fierce. None. I have no enemies. Holmes gave a soft grunt, almost imperceptible. I recognized it as disbelief, politely stifled. Forgive me, he said, but I suspect that a woman of your lineage and reputation could not have reached your years without cultivating a few adversaries. What of your late husband? Count Victor Chernin died in a hunting accident in Galicia 4 years ago. His affairs were settled. Our Ester ATE in Krakow remains intact, though I spend most of my time now in London. Wimpole Street is my home. Holmes nodded. And those within that home? Servants, companions, distant relatives. I live alone, but for my staff, there are 4 of them. Loyal. None would dare. People often dare more than we believe, Holmes said evenly, especially those we trust. The Countess stiffened but said nothing. Holmes steepled his fingers. Let us presume, he said, that this was not a threat, but a message. What might someone wish to tell you, Countess? Without words, she met his eyes. That they can reach me, that I am vulnerable. Perhaps, or perhaps the message is not for you at all. What do you mean? Holmes stood and paced. Imagine a criminal of singular cunning. They have not yet committed a crime, or at least, not one we recognize, but they wish to involve me, to test me. What better way than a cryptic riddle? A box of teeth, a riddle without a question, something to provoke interest, but not action. The Countess frowned. You think this is a game? I think it may be the beginning of one. And games, Countess, are rarely played alone. There was a silence then, filled only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional hiss of the fire. Have you received anything else unusual of late? Holmes asked. Letters, visitors, items left behind. The Countess hesitated. There was one thing, ... Yes. 3 days ago, a man approached me outside the Royal Academy. He was disheveled, his coat torn, one shoe missing. I thought he was mad. He blocked my path, looked me in the eye, and said, The mouth remembers what the brain forgets. Then he walked away. Holmes stopped pacing. And you did not report this. I thought he was a drunkard or a lunatic. And now, she was pale. Now I think I should not have dismissed him. Holmes turned to me. Watson, the phrase, does it suggest anything? I considered it. It sounds like nonsense, but perhaps poetic nonsense. Holmes's eyes glittered. Or code. The mouth remembers. What the brain forgets. Teeth. Teeth do not decay all at once. Watson, they hold memory in their wear, in their shape, in their placement, as fingerprints do. Could these teeth identify someone? They could, or they could represent a group of someones, if one knew how to read them. He turned back to the Countess. I will require access to your household, your staff, their names and movements, and I would like to examine the parcel's location on your property, discreetly. The Countess rose. You shall have it. She turned to go, then paused. I should warn you, Mr. Holmes, if this is a game, as you say, it is one I do not wish to play. Holmes gave her a half-smile. Then it is fortunate, madame, that I play on your behalf. She departed with the same quiet intensity with which she had arrived. Holmes turned to me, eyes alight. There's more here, Watson. Much more. We are not dealing with madness. We are dealing with intention, cold, deliberate. And he stopped, his gaze falling on the Hatbox again, and personal. You believe the Countess is hiding something? No, Holmes said. I believe someone is hiding something from her. He tapped the box once with a single, bony finger, and they are using teeth to speak. Chapter 3. A scene of deception that afternoon. The fog had thinned, but not lifted. It lingered above Wimpole Street like a watchful spirit, softening every sound and bleaching the world of its color. Holmes and I arrived at number 43 shortly after 2 o'clock, summoned by a discreet note from the Countess herself. The residence, though narrow, was stately, a tall Georgian townhome with black iron fencing and ivy climbing the brick in perfect symmetry. It was neither opulent nor plain. It was the kind of house designed to neither attract attention nor apologize for itself. We were met at the door by Ashby, the same footman who had delivered the Hatbox earlier that morning. His complexion had not improved. This way, gentlemen, he said, ushering us into a dim, wood-paneled foyer. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and polish. At Holmes's direction, Ashby led us directly to the service entrance in the rear, a modest door that opened onto a paved courtyard. There, against the wall near the tradesman's gate, stood a small iron parcel table. This is where it was found, Ashby said, pointing. The milk and post are usually placed here, sir, but this morning just the box. Holmes crouched beside the table, examining it closely. The iron surface had a thin smear of dried rain, but no clear footprints or markings remained. No chalk, no wax, no sign of sealing, he murmured. Was anything else disturbed? Not that I saw, sir. The gate was shut, locked from inside. Holmes stood and turned slowly, scanning the perimeter. The walls enclosing the yard were high, but not insurmountable. Has anyone in the household, cook, maid, or otherwise, reported hearing anything unusual last night? Movement, voices, a sound in the courtyard. Ashby hesitated. Well, ... Mrs. Belling, the cook. She did mention a strange sound. Said she heard a sort of scraping just before dawn, but I thought it was a cat. Holmes nodded. Cats rarely carry Hatbox. I'd like to speak with her. Ashby looked slightly pained, but led us back inside. We passed through the scullery and into the narrow staff corridor, where the kitchen sat warm and bright. A stout woman in her 50s stood at the stove, stirring something aromatic. She turned as we entered, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Belling? Holmes asked. Yes, sir. I assume you're the detective. She said, detective like one might say, rat-catcher. You mentioned hearing a noise this morning. That, I did. Around 5, just before the lamps went out. I was preparing bread for the oven when I heard a dragging sound, like something heavy being moved on stone. You looked. She sniffed. I opened the door, saw nothing. Fog was thick as soup. I'm not about to go poking about in that. Holmes leaned forward, and the gate, still shut, tightly, sir, bolted from the inside. As always, Holmes offered a slight bow. Thank you. From the kitchen, we were led up the servants' stairwell and into the drawing room, where the Countess waited. The Hatbox had been returned to her upon Holmes's request, and now sat beneath a bell jar upon a side table. Looking somehow more macabre beneath the glass, Holmes approached it with renewed intensity. Lifting the glass and opening the box once more, he removed several teeth with tweezers, arranging them on a black lacquered tray like chess pieces. "I've studied them more closely," he said, "and I believe you were quite right, Countess. These were chosen deliberately, not at random." "How so?" I asked, standing just behind him. "There are precisely 26 teeth in this box," Holmes replied. "Not a complete human set. And look here, 2 of them are not human at all. One ivory, the other ... ceramic, a modern prosthetic. Could they represent individuals?" I offered. "Each tooth a person." "Possibly," Holmes said, "but more likely they represent parts of a whole, a puzzle. Note the arrangement." He pointed to the inner ring. 6 molars, then a ring of 12 smaller teeth, and finally an outer rim of 8, unevenly spaced. "It's a map," Holmes murmured. I blinked. "A map? Not in the literal sense, but a design, a message conveyed in geometry. It may align with something, a symbol, a location, even a cipher, but we cannot solve it here." He turned to the Countess. "May I take the box to Baker Street for further study?" "You may," she said without hesitation. Holmes carefully repacked the teeth, returning the box to its glass case for safe transit. "I will also need the names and histories of everyone who lives or works in this house, even those who have left recently." The Countess handed him a sealed envelope. "I anticipated you might." "Excellent." Just then, Ashby returned with a note on a silver tray. "From Inspector Lestrade, sir. He's requested your presence at Camden Mortuary. Urgent." Holmes took the note, read it, and smiled faintly. "Well," he said, standing, "it appears the game is afoot, Watson." I frowned. "A body." Holmes turned toward the door, lifting the hatbox as he went. "Not quite." Ajaw. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Holmes and I returned to Wimpole Street shortly after dusk, having paid our brief visit to Camden Mortuary, a visit which, while revealing, did not yield the certainty Holmes sought. The lower jaw in question had no surviving records to match it against, though Holmes studied the molar where, as if deciphering ancient script. "I do not yet know whose mouth it came from," he said, "but I am increasingly confident of one thing. It is not the last part of them we will see." When we re-entered the Countess's residence, she was waiting in the study, a fire crackling behind her, and a sheaf of papers in her lap. At Holmes's request, she had gathered her household staff and instructed them to await questioning. What struck me most as we entered was her composure. The Countess seemed not merely calm but watchful, as if she too had begun to suspect the house itself of harboring secrets. Holmes gave her a brief nod. "May we speak to them one at a time?" "Of course. I've had them wait in the parlor. Ashby will bring them in turn." Ashby entered at once, as if on cue, and disappeared down the hallway. Holmes took his usual seat near the window, folding his legs neatly beneath him and placing the hatbox now secured in a sealed canvas bag by his chair. I sat to his right, notebook open, though I had long since given up trying to match Holmes in the art of questioning. My task, as always, was to observe and to marvel. 1. Ashby. The footman, the young footman, entered first, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders stiff. Holmes greeted him with a soft, "Good evening, Mr. Ashby. You've served the Countess for how long?" 3 years, sir. Military background. Briefly, Irish Guards. Discharged after a knee injury. Holmes's eyes flickered to the way Ashby stood. Weight shifted subtly to the right. "Yes, I see. And your duties?" "Mostly errands. Reception of guests. Deliveries." "You discovered the parcel?" "Yes, sir. And no sign of who left it?" "No." Sir Holmes studied him a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. "You may return to the parlor. Please send in Mrs. Belling to..." "Mrs. Belling." The cook entered with less formality, smoothing her apron nervously as she sat. "Mrs. Belling," Holmes began, "you heard something the morning the box appeared." She nodded. "A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged." "Describe the time again." "Just before 5. The fire had barely caught." "Was the gate open at any time?" "Not that I know of." "I hadn't touched it." Holmes tapped his fingers on the armrest. "Is there anyone in the house you do not trust?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Anyone whose presence here has felt unsettling." Mrs. Belling hesitated. "I shouldn't speak ill, sir... but I've always thought Mr. Greaves was a bit odd. The librarian keeps to himself, stays up late." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Thank you. You've been helpful." She left more quickly than she entered. 3. Mr. Greaves. The librarian, the man who entered next, was tall, angular, and pallid, the kind of pale that one acquires, not through illness but through years spent in the company of ink and dim lamps. His spectacles were wire-rimmed, and his lips twitched faintly, even when silent. "Mr. Greaves," Holmes greeted him. "Detective." The man's voice was dry and deliberate. "You believe the box to be a threat. I believe it to be a message. Does it speak to you?" Greaves gave a tight smile. "I've catalogued teeth before, though rarely in this context. You're an academic, formerly of Cambridge. My health declined. I now manage the Countess's personal library, and your whereabouts the night the box arrived." "In the library. I was indexing Hungarian manuscripts. I have the logs. You were alone." "I always am." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recognize the phrase, 'The mouth remembers what the brain forgets'?" Greaves didn't answer immediately. Then, "Sounds almost Freudian, but also anatomical. The jaw stores tension, trauma even. In metaphor, perhaps memory." "You may go," Holmes said, "but stay close." Greaves nodded once, and departed for Marta. The maid the last to enter was Marta, a small, dark-haired woman of indeterminate age, with wide-set eyes that darted across the room as she entered. She clutched her apron like a shield. "You've worked here for how long, Marta?" Holmes asked gently. 8 months. "And before that, with a family in Belgravia. Why did you leave?" "They moved to France." "Did you see or hear anything unusual on the morning the box appeared?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I sleep on the top floor." "I hear little." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You're afraid?" She looked at him, startled. "I'm afraid something bad is happening," she said softly. "The Countess has been so quiet lately, and now ... This Holmes studied her face, then dismissed her with a quiet thank you. When the door had shut behind her, Holmes sat motionless, staring into the hearth. "Well," I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity, "what do you think?" He didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "Someone in this house knows what that box means, or fears it. We are not yet dealing with murder, Watson, but with rehearsal. Something is being staged, and the cast is nearly assembled." He tapped the envelope containing the staff records. "But I need to see the script." Chapter 5. First Suspects, the Red Herring. The following morning dawned grey and sullen. A drizzle had begun to mist the city streets, as though London itself wished to obscure its own secrets. Holmes, having not slept at all, sat at the breakfast table with the Countess's household dossier spread before him, poring over pages of employment history, letters of reference, and fragments of handwriting samples. He had already filled 2 pages of his own notebook with a cipher of markings, indecipherable to me, arrows, dots, and short phrases in Latin or Greek. I let him work in silence, sipping my tea and listening to the occasional scratch of his pen. "It's too clean," he muttered at last. "The household, the arrangement, for servants, all competent, all unblemished on record. Greaves with his Cambridge credentials, Ashby with military discipline, Marta with quiet obedience, and Belling with 40 years of kitchens behind her. And yet, ... double quotes." He tapped his notebook. ... "One of them is playing a deeper game." I set down my cup. "Greaves, then, the librarian, you seemed most suspicious of him." Holmes smiled faintly. "Suspicion is an easy meal, Watson. I have an appetite for patterns." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual weary grace, carrying a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it and scanned its contents. "Lestrade," he said. "They've made an arrest." "Already?" Holmes handed me the telegram. "To Holmes. Suspect detained this morning. Porter from neighboring house claims he saw a man near Countess's rear gate night before delivery. Man matches description of Mr. Greaves. Request your opinion." Lestrade whistled low. "So the librarian was seen loitering." Holmes gave no reply. He rose, coat in hand. "Come, Watson, let us see what the good inspector believes he's caught in his net." At Scotland Yard, we found Inspector Lestrade in fine spirits, a condition I had long since learned to treat with caution. He ushered us into a side room, where a pale, nervous-looking man sat on a wooden bench under a gaslight. His spectacles were gone, his collar askew. It was Greaves. "Caught him near St. Mary's Crescent just before dawn," Lestrade said, rubbing his hands. "Had his coat inside out, shoes muddy. Porter at number 41 said he'd seen him skulking near the Countess's house late Tuesday." Holmes said nothing, merely stepped closer and inspected the man's hands. Greaves sat rigid, eyes wide behind his sunken sockets. "Greaves," Holmes said softly, "What were you doing in Wimpole Street that night?" I told them. The man muttered, "I went out for air. I often walk at night. I find it clears the mind." "Do you often walk near the Countess's service gate?" Yes. Sometimes I walk past the square and circle back. I enjoy the symmetry." Lestrade scoffed. "Symmetry, eh? And what about this?" He held up a small canvas pouch, found in his coat pocket. Lestrade said, "Guess what's inside." He opened it carefully. Within were 2 human teeth, clean and dry, wrapped in cloth. Greaves buried his face in his hands. "I didn't steal them," he said quickly. "They were left in a drawer of the library desk. I found them a week ago. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't know what they meant." Holmes was watching him keenly, every line of Greaves's body under scrutiny. "Why carry them with you?" Holmes asked. "I wanted to compare them, to find out if they were real. There's a dentist in Lambeth I've used for reference before. ... Lestrade rolled his eyes. "A librarian with a side interest in forensic odontology. Is it?" Holmes held up a hand. "You examined them in the library when last Friday and said nothing to the Countess?" "No. I thought it was some student prank. We've had thefts before. I didn't think..." He broke off. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Has his room been searched?" "Nothing out of the ordinary. Books, papers, old dental texts." Oddly enough, Holmes's expression sharpened. "Release him." Lestrade blinked. "Release him. He's not our man." With teeth in his pocket, Holmes's voice dropped an octave. "Too obvious. Planted, perhaps. And if he were the sender of the Hatbox, he would not risk carrying evidence on his person." "No. Someone wants us looking at Greaves." Holmes turned back to Greaves. "Return to the house. Say nothing, but report any further discoveries to me directly, no matter how small." The librarian nodded, dazed, and was escorted out. Lestrade looked disgruntled. "Well, if he's not the one, then who is?" Holmes retrieved his hat and turned to go. "Not who yet, Lestrade, but why. Until we understand that, every man and woman near this case is both suspect and victim." Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the pouch of teeth on the desk beside the sealed Hatbox. "He's being watched, Watson. Someone within that house is toying with him, and with us." "You believe the teeth were planted?" "I believe the Countess's library has more than just books inside it, and someone wishes to obscure who put them there." I rubbed my temples. "But to what end?" Holmes did not answer directly. He opened his notebook and added a new mark, a small, precise X beside Greaves's name. "A red herring," he said. "But even red herrings leave a scent." Chapter 6. The secret clue. A hidden inconsistency. 2 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The Countess sent no word, and no new packages arrived. The press had caught only the faintest whisper of unusual circumstances at Wimpole Street, and Scotland Yard had no fresh discoveries to report. The Hatbox remained locked in Holmes's study, and I could sense a growing tension in him as, though the silence itself had become suspect. "It's too calm," Holmes said that morning, gazing through the Fog Street window. "The first move was made with such a ceremony. This lull, it's not delayed. It's part of the design." I was about to press him further when he suddenly snapped his fingers. "The letters," he said. "Letters. The Countess's correspondency offered me her household dossier, but not her mail. Watson, would you be so kind as to accompany me to Wimpole Street? I believe we've overlooked something elementary. The Countess received us in her upstairs study, a smaller, more intimate space than the drawing room, lined with narrow bookshelves and smelling faintly of Turkish tobacco. She seemed tired, the corners of her eyes lined with sleeplessness. Still, her posture was impeccable, her voice firm. "I have not received another parcel," she said before Holmes could speak. "Nor have my staff reported anything new." "I don't doubt it," Holmes said. "But I would like to examine your recent mail, particularly any that arrived in the last 2 weeks, even those you dismissed as inconsequential." She raised an eyebrow. "You suspect the message began before the box?" "I suspect it never began with the box," Holmes replied. "Only the performance did. The correspondence may be where the composer tuned his instrument." Without another word, the Countess opened a lacquered cabinet beside her desk and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with green silk. She handed them to Holmes, who thanked her briskly and laid them out across the desk. For nearly an hour, we watched him read in total silence. He held each envelope to the light, examined postmarks, handwriting, paperweight. He discarded most within seconds. though now and again he would pause, his fingers hovering over a corner or phrase, and make a mark in his notebook. At last, he set one letter aside, separate from the rest. This one. The Countess leaned forward. That it's from a cousin in Vienna. Amelia. Holmes tapped the postmark. Indeed, and yet, it was not posted in Austria at all. Look closely. I leaned in. The envelope bore the address neatly printed in a woman's hand, but the postmark, while smudged, read, Bloomsbury District Office, London. The writing is careful, Holmes continued, but impersonal. The message within refers to details only someone in the Countess's family would know, but makes no mention of past conversations, family names, or even shared griefs. It's as though the writer had studied her life, but did not live within it. He opened the letter and read aloud, Dear Elsbieta, I write in the cold season with warm thoughts. We are all well here, and I trust London has not become too grey for your soul. Do you still keep that old clock by the window? I remember the ticking comfort of it. Such things help us keep time when our memories cannot. Yours, Amelia. The Countess frowned. That does sound like her, but now that you point it out, no mention of my brother, or the estate. Holmes nodded. And the phrase, such things help us keep time when our memories cannot. Does that remind you of anything? I spoke before the Countess could reply. The madman's phrase, the mouth remembers what the brain forgets. Precisely, Holmes said. It is not the same phrase, but the structure is identical. A poetic contrast, linking the body to memory. Both are almost literary, and both are wrong-footed, as if translated and reassembled. He held up the envelope again. This was not sent from Vienna. It was planted nearby, likely within a mile or two of the house. The Countess exhaled slowly. So someone is mimicking my family. Holmes folded the letter carefully. Not just mimicking, shadowing. This person knows what's important to you, your house, your memories, your private griefs, and they are twisting those elements into a kind of ritual theater. The box, the phrase, this letter, they are not isolated gestures. They are acts in a sequence. But to what end? I asked. That, Holmes said softly, is what we must discover before the final act is performed. We left Wimpole Street just after noon. The letter tucked safely in Holmes's coat. He was silent for much of the walk back to Baker Street, his steps brisk, eyes unfocused though. I could tell his mind was grinding furiously behind them. Only once we returned to the sitting room did he speak. Watson, you recall Greaves mentioned a dentist in Lamb? Yes, the one he meant to consult about the teeth he found. Holmes retrieved the hatbox from his study and lifted the lid. One by one, he removed the teeth and placed them gently on the black tray once again. Then, without explanation, he pointed to one of the prosthetic molars. This one. See the base? That's a modern dental plate. Ivory, but unusually carved. I've seen this craftsmanship once before, in a case from Lambeth 2 years ago. A man murdered his business partner over a debt, and had a false molar carved with a hidden gold mark. He held it to the light. And this one, he whispered, has something similar. I peered closer. Beneath the ivory sheen, a faint Eckinger number, 7, a Roman numeral. I asked, possibly, or a position in a series. This was not placed here for anatomical accuracy. It was chosen. Holmes replaced the tooth and shut the box. A clue, Watson, but one we were not meant to find quickly. The villain is clever, but no deception is perfect. He stood and retrieved his hat. Where are we going now? I asked. He smiled without warmth. It's time we spoke to the man who made this tooth. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. It was a bleak afternoon when we arrived in Lambeth, the sort of leaden sky under which London seems to press in on itself. The air smelt of coal smoke and boiled linen, and the narrow alleys twisted like veins into the back streets of the city's tired heart. Holmes led the way down an unmarked cobblestone lane, his steps decisive. After several turns, he paused before a low-slung door bearing the peeling sign, A. Beckett, dental technician, prosthetics, goldwork, mending. He rapped twice with his knuckles, then once with the tip of his walking stick. After a pause, the door creaked open, revealing a stooped man in a white smock, his spectacles perched precariously on a hawk-like nose. He looked at Holmes with suspicion, then at me with utter indifference. You're not here for molars, he said. Too well, and no one comes by appointment. Holmes offered a courteous bow. Mr. Beckett, I believe, we come not for service, but information. You once fitted a rather unusual dental plate, a very with a Roman numeral etched beneath. The old man narrowed his eyes. Could be mine, could be half a dozen others. You bring the plate. Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved the prosthetic tooth in question, wrapped in linen. Beckett took it gingerly, turned it in his fingers, and after only a few seconds gave a slow, reluctant nod. Mine, he muttered. I crafted that myself. Unique mark. Clients don't want to admit where they got their plates, so I started numbering them. Keeps my books honest. That's No. 7. Done 2 years ago. Holmes leaned forward. And for whom? Beckett's mouth twisted. Client confidentiality, sir. Even when the piece turns up in a box of human teeth. The old man blinked. In what? A box, black lacquered, delivered to a private residence. Inside 23 human teeth, including this one. Does that jog your memory, Mr. Beckett? He stared at Holmes, then at the tooth in his hand, as if it had betrayed him. Yes, I remember. The man's name was Hobb, a quiet fellow, thin as a rail, pale skin, pink-rimmed eyes, always wore gloves, didn't speak much, sent notes instead, brought in a set of impressions, and paid in full, cash. Do you have a record of his address? I asked. Beckett shook his head. None, he gave, but I remember where I delivered the final set. Off Doughty Street, boarding house called the Vicarage. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Do you recall the room? Top floor, third from the left. I remember because the doorman didn't want to take me up. Said the tenant kept odd hours and had too many boxes. Holmes returned the tooth to its wrappings with care. You've been most helpful, he said. If anyone else inquires about this tooth, or Mr. Hobb, I suggest you forget everything you've said. For your own safety. The old man paled. Is he dangerous? Holmes didn't answer. He simply turned and exited into the Grey Street dot. As we approached the Vicarage, a tall, Suit Street house near the corner of John Street, I felt an odd chill creep up my spine. Something about it felt sterile, emptied of life. The windows were clean but lifeless. No smoke from the chimneys, no sound of tenants. Holmes studied the facade for a moment, then rapped briskly on the door. After a delay, a harried woman opened at a housekeeper by the look of her. In her late 50s, hair in a greying bun. She looked us over with caution. No rooms, she muttered. We're not seeking lodgings, Holmes said, flashing his card. We're inquiring about a former boarder, a Mr. Hobb. The woman's expression stiffened. Hobb? Lord, I haven't heard that name in months. Tall, sickly type. Yes. When did he leave? She hesitated. That's the strange part, sir. He never did. What do you mean? Well, he paid 6 months' rent in advance. Never spoke a word, just slid notes under the kitchen door. Then one day, his door was locked, and no one answered. I waited a week, then 2. Thought maybe he'd slipped out at night. Finally, the constable breaks in. What did you find? I asked. She shivered. Nothing. Room was empty. Bed untouched. No clothes, no basin, no luggage. Just a dozen wooden hat boxes, stacked in a pyramid by the window. Holmes's voice sharpened. Yes, sir. Black, but they were all, empty. Dry as bones. He turned to me with an intensity I hadn't seen in days. Watson, do you see? We assumed the box sent to the Countess was singular, a dramatic gesture. But it's not. It's part of a sequence, a series. Like those teeth. You think there are more? I'm certain of it. Holmes asked to see the room, and the housekeeper reluctantly led us up. The corridor smelled of disuse and camphor. When she unlocked the door, a wave of cold air met us. The room was sparse. Single bed, bare floorboards, soot-smudged window. But against the far wall, a faint circular stain remained where the pyramid of boxes had once stood. Holmes crouched, examining the floor with a magnifying lens. Then, something caught his eye, a sliver of wax near the floorboard. He picked it up, sniffed it. Sealing wax, he murmured. Black. Same kind as used on the Countess's box. Watson, this man didn't just vanish. He prepared his own disappearance, cleaned his prints, burned his effects, and left just enough to bait the next move. He stood, eyes scanning the room, but something went wrong, or changed. He was waiting for something, or someone. I shivered. This is more than madness, Holmes. Yes, he said. This is the method. As we descended the stairs, Holmes stopped abruptly on the second-floor landing. A letter was lying on the floor, pushed under a door, addressed in the same delicate hand as the one the Countess had received. He picked it up. It read, "When the mouth forgets, the teeth remember. The 7th has spoken. Now we wait for the 8th." Holmes exhaled slowly, as if absorbing a chill deeper than air. "This is no longer about the Countess alone," he said. "This is a message to someone else, or something larger still." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. We returned to Baker Street well past sundown, the shadows of London stretching long across the cobbled streets. Holmes was unusually quiet on the cab ride, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in contemplation. I recognized the look. He was forming a web, teasing meaning from threads the rest of us could not see. Once inside our sitting room, Holmes lit the fire, though the room was warm enough without it. He paced the rug twice, then turned abruptly to me. "Watson," he said, "you recall the Countess's manservant? That tremor in his left hand?" I nodded. "A subtle palsy, I thought, nothing more." Indeed, so it appeared, but there was something in his speech, an inconsistency of accent. His vowels were too clean for someone raised in Lancashire, as he claimed. "You believe he was lying?" "Not merely lying," Holmes said, pouring himself a cup of tea. "Performing, which brings me to a decision. We must pay Mr. Elric another visit." I raised an eyebrow. "To confront him?" Holmes shook his head. "Confrontation is for those who wish to be resisted. I intend instead to provoke." The following morning, we were received again at the Countess's townhome. The maid led us not to the drawing room, but to the library, a shadowed space heavy with dust and dark wood. Elric was already there, rearranging a set of porcelain figurines on a mantelpiece. He turned at our approach, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said coolly, "I presume you've made progress." Holmes made a show of straightening his cuffs. "Some, yes. Enough to believe this incident may not be isolated. In fact, I now think the box delivered to your mistress was intended for you." Elric's brow twitched. "I beg your pardon." Holmes stepped closer, deliberately invading the man's space. "The Countess may have received it, but she did not open it. You did. You carried it, handled it, possibly recognized something within, a particular molar, perhaps." There was the briefest hesitation, no more than a flicker of breath before Elric responded. "You overreach, sir." "Do I?" Holmes replied. He plucked one of the porcelain figurines from the mantel, held it to the light. "Interesting thing about bones. Once boiled and bleached, it's almost indistinguishable from ivory. I wonder how many of these figures have been inspected closely." Elric stepped forward swiftly. "Those are antiques. The Countess's father collected them." Holmes smiled faintly and set the piece down with care. "Of course." He turned and strolled toward the bookshelf, trailing a finger across the spines. "I must say," he continued, "you keep a meticulous library, but I wonder why the absence of volumes on dentistry. Not one on oral anatomy, prosthetics, or the artisan's craft. And yet, in your mistress's own account, it was you who suggested the police examine the dental plate first." Elric's voice tightened. "I have a rudimentary knowledge of anatomy, nothing more." Holmes turned on his heel. "You see, Mr. Elric, rudimentary knowledge does not suggest Latin dental nomenclature in official correspondence, nor does it lead one to identify a Roman numeral etched in a hidden cavity." Elric's jaw tightened. I could almost hear the grinding of his teeth. "Is there a question in your accusations, Mr. Holmes?" "No," Holmes said softly. "Only an observation. You are not who you pretend to be, and you've known the identity of the man called Hobb far longer than you've admitted." Back on the street, Holmes chuckled quietly to himself as we walked. "You saw it, Watson." I blinked. "Saw what?" "The glove." I frowned. "He wasn't wearing gloves." "Exactly." Holmes stopped, adjusting his collar against the breeze. "When we first met him, he wore gloves, indoors, a gentleman's pair, doeskin tan. Today, nothing. And yet the tremor in his left hand had vanished entirely. Curious, don't you think?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Slowly, understanding crept in. "You believe the manservant is not the same man we met 2 days ago?" Holmes's eyes glinted. Precisely that evening, Holmes sent a telegram to Inspector Lestrade, requesting quiet surveillance on the Countess's home, and particularly her servant staff. He followed it with a second, to the Royal Dental College, asking for any records concerning prosthetic commissions containing engraved markings. As he sealed the envelope, I ventured to ask the question I had kept quiet for hours. "Holmes, what was your aim today? You all but accused Elric of being complicit." "I didn't need him to confess," Holmes replied, "only to shift. Behavior is like sediment. When left alone, it settles. But stir it, introduce the right irritant and..." He revealed the hidden layers. He tapped the sealed telegram against the table. "Elric, or the man posing as him, knows we're closing in. He will either run or retaliate. Either suits me. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger boy. He bore a narrow box, wrapped in brown paper, and addressed in the same delicate script as the Countess's letter. Holmes sliced the string and opened the parcel with slow deliberation. Inside was a single object, a photograph. It showed a young boy no older than 12, standing beside a woman in a heavy velvet dress. Both figures had their faces scratched out with surgical precision. On the back was written, in looping ink, "Memory begins where pain resides. Box 8 comes at dawn." We stood in silence for a long moment. Then Holmes whispered, almost to himself, "He's accelerating." I swallowed. "What does it mean?" Holmes's expression hardened. "It means we no longer dictate the pace of this game." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes. Again dawn broke with a thin veil of mist across Baker Street, the early July sun struggling to pierce through London's weary fog. I awoke to the clatter of a tray, Mrs. Hudson delivering a modest breakfast. Her brows furrowed with unease. "It came while you were still asleep, Doctor," she whispered, nodding toward the small parcel that now sat upon our table. "Just like the last one. The boy who brought it wouldn't say a word." I turned sharply to Holmes, who was already seated in his armchair, fingers steepled, watching the parcel as though it might detonate. "Box 8, he murmured. "As promised." The paper was the same coarse, oil-stained, tied with thin twine. Holmes examined the corners, sniffed the seal, then opened it with the same care one might show a venomous serpent. Inside was another box, this one smaller than the first, made of polished cherrywood, locked with a tiny brass latch. But what chilled me to the bone was the sound it made as Holmes lifted it, a faint rattle, dry and hollow. Holmes opened it. Another set of teeth. But these were different, not artificial, not affixed to a plate or frame. These were human, real, stained with age, several blackened with decay. For molars, a canine, and what remained of an incisor. Beneath them lay a folded piece of paper. Holmes unfolded it. He never learned to smile. Can you blame me? No signature, no handwriting to match anything we'd yet seen. Holmes sat perfectly still for a moment, then reached for his violin. The low, dissonant note he played sent a chill through me. It was his mind's way of easing into a knot too tangled for words. "We must visit St. Bartholomew's," he said, abruptly rising. Now, by mid-morning, we were standing in the mortuary chambers beneath St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Holmes, speaking in hushed tones with the mortician, a Mr. S, whose haggard face suggested he'd been given little rest of late. "I tell you, Mr. Holmes," Snaith said, "the jaw was almost entirely destroyed. We couldn't make much of it, but we did find one plate tucked beneath the tongue, as if deliberately hidden." He handed Holmes a small velvet pouch. From it, Holmes drew a fragment of dental plate, not from the original Hatbox, but clearly crafted in the same manner. This one bore no numbers, no etchings, but had been wrapped in silk that smelled faintly of formaldehyde. "What of the body?" Holmes asked. Snaith hesitated. "Still unidentified. Male, roughly fit. But the face? Well, I'd rather not say." Holmes pressed him gently, and after a moment, Snaith led us to a long drawer, which he opened with solemnity. Inside lay the remains of a man, his features disfigured by trauma or deliberate mutilation. It was difficult to tell. Holmes leaned in, inspecting the mouth. "There's space here," he murmured, almost to himself. "Yes, these would have belonged." He motioned to me, and I handed him the second box, the one delivered that very morning. Snaith turned pale. "Human teeth," he whispered. "Are these his?" Holmes nodded slowly. "It would seem so. The killer removed them after death, I believe. But why send them to us?" He turned to me, eyes suddenly alight with fierce energy. "To make a point. Back at Baker Street, Lestrade arrived not long after noon, flushed and irritable. "I've just come from Bloomsbury," he grumbled, slamming his bowler onto the table. "Another delivery. Same handwriting. This one came to Scotland Yard directly." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "To whom was it addressed?" "To me," Lestrade said, "and I don't mind telling you, it was unpleasant. A single tooth, mounted on a playing card, the fool. No note, no explanation." Holmes's expression tightened. "That's bold, bold." Lestrade exploded. "It's perverse. What kind of madman sends pieces of corpses to the yard?" Holmes rose, pacing slowly. "One with confidence. One who believes we are chasing ghosts while he walks freely among us. Consider the letters, the staged identity of Elric, The inconsistency in the Countess's household. It's not madness, it's orchestration, I interjected. But what of the message? The tooth on a card, the fool. Holmes turned sharply. It's not just symbolic, it's directed. The fool is a wanderer, an outsider, someone who watches but does not act until it's too late. He paused. He's mocking us. Lestrade scowled. Well, we'll double patrols, postmen at the Countess's house. And no, Holmes said, cutting him off. That's what he wants. This isn't about protection, it's about provocation. Lestrade folded his arms. So we do nothing. Holmes smiled thinly. We bait him. Let him believe we've missed something. Let him get close, again close enough to make his final move. That evening, as twilight descended once more over the rooftops of London, Holmes sat by the fire, staring at the photographs laid before him. The boy, the woman with her face scratched away, the teeth now cleaned and set in a new box, which Holmes had labeled meticulously. It's too methodical, he said, too ritualistic. I looked up from my notebook. You think it's more than vengeance? I think, Holmes said quietly, that it's about memory. Someone is exhuming the past, tooth by tooth, and we've only just begun to uncover whose memory it truly is. A soft knock interrupted Mrs. Hudson again. Holding a telegram, Holmes opened it. Cited match to boy in photograph. Lambeth Orphanage, 1871. Cleric name Rev. Jonah Crail, S. Holmes's eyes darkened. Now, he said, it begins to bleed. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The following morning broke under a grey sky, the city painted in muted tones of coal and smoke. Holmes rose early, his mood unreadable as he paced before the hearth. He had slept little, if at all, and the telegram from Inspector Stanley Redding remained clutched in his fingers like scripture. Lambeth Orphanage, Reverend Jonah Crail, 1871. By 8:30, we were in a hansom cab rattling down Charing Cross Road toward Lambeth. The streets busy with carriages and morning foot traffic. Holmes said little, save for a remark about the abysmal state of the cab's axles, but I knew his mind was elsewhere, buried, deep in a memory that wasn't his own. The orphanage, when we arrived, stood like a sentinel of forgotten sorrows. The building was narrow, 3 stories of soot-darkened brick, with boarded windows on the upper floors. A rusted iron plaque above the door read simply, St. Alwyn's Refuge for the Forsaken. It had not been an active institution for years. A groundskeeper, an elderly man named Fitch, answered the bell. After some delay, he eyed Holmes and me warily, rubbing his beard with tar-stained fingers. St. Alwyn's has been shut for nearly 10 years now, he grunted. Records went to the diocesan archive. Ain't no children here no more. Holmes presented his card with a slight nod. We aren't here for the children, Mr. Fitch. We're here for the ghosts. The man squinted at the card, then grudgingly stepped aside. We were led through a cramped vestibule into a corridor whose plaster peeled in sheets and whose floors creaked with every breath. Dust danced in the thin beams of light from a shattered skylight overhead. The smell was of mildew, wood rot, and something faintly antiseptic. Reverend Crail, Holmes asked. Fitch spat to the side. Dead, hanged himself. 77. Rope in the bell tower. Holmes did not blink. And before that, did he work here long? 12 years. Ran the place with a Bible in one hand and the birch in the other. Fitch led us into what had once been the dining hall. Rows of empty benches stretched beneath a crossbeam ceiling, and at the far end stood a lectern, worn smooth at its edge. Holmes walked the length of the room slowly, running his gloved fingers across the back of each bench. He stopped at the far corner, where the wall bore a faded mural, a crude depiction of St. Alwyn, lifting a torch amidst a crowd of children. Punishments? Holmes asked suddenly. Fitch hesitated. There were whispers. Boys locked in the root cellar, made to scrub the floor with their own shirts, teeth knocked out with sticks, but no one ever proved it. Holmes turned to me. A pattern emerges, Watson. Broken teeth, forgotten boys, a man who preached penance but delivered cruelty, and this Reverend Crail. I asked, do you believe he was the first victim? Holmes's eyes narrowed. No, I believe he was the first sacrifice. The timeline aligns. He died in 1877, 6 years after a boy, now grown, may have come of age to revisit old wounds. He turned back to Fitch. Do you remember a boy, thin, pale, with a lisp or speech defect, possibly one with scarring around the mouth? Fitch furrowed his brow. There was one, always quiet, draw strange things on the walls, faces without eyes, mouths full of teeth. They called him Mute Will. Didn't speak, but he listened. Crail hated him. Holmes went very still. Mute Will, Fitch nodded. Disappeared one winter. Crail said he ran off during the snowstorm, but some of the boys said they saw him in the cellar, bleeding from the gums. Never saw him again. Holmes's fingers twitched. And no search. Fitch shook his head. Not back then. Kids went missing all the time. The workhouses took or worse. Holmes turned sharply and began to pace. Mute Will Elric the Hatbox. The message, he never learned to smile. Watson, he's not just taunting us. He's recreating something. A cycle. A ritual. Each step echoes something buried. And the Countess, I asked, where does she fit into this? Holmes paused. She is not innocent, but I believe she is peripheral. A witness, perhaps. Or a keeper of some secret. He turned to Fitch once more. Did Reverend Crail have private records? The old man hesitated. There's a locked room upstairs. His quarters. I still have the key, but it's not been opened in years. Without a word, Holmes followed him. The narrow stairs groaned underfoot as we ascended to the top floor. The door in question bore heavy bolts and a rusted padlock, which Fitch opened with a skeleton key that jingled like coins in his palm. The room was preserved in dust and shadow. A bed, a washbasin, a desk littered with yellowing paper, and above the desk, a row of crude drawings tacked to the wall. Holmes stepped forward, lifting one of the drawings carefully. A child's hand, depicted over and over, mouth agape with teeth drawn in heavy black ink. In each one, more teeth were missing. In the final drawing, the mouth was empty, and in place of the eyes were smudged X's. They called him Mute Will. Holmes repeated, but he has found his voice at last. He opened one of the desk drawers and found a rotting leather journal. The first few pages were filled with Crowell's spidery script Bible verses, notes on discipline, but toward the middle, the handwriting faltered. One passage stood out. The boy watches me. I feel him behind my eyes. When I sleep, I see teeth, falling, crumbling, biting into my wrists. God forgive me. I cannot pray them away. Holmes closed the journal gently. It's not just a crime, he whispered. It's a confession painted in bone. Chapter 11. The Bait Holmes. Grand strategy. We returned to Baker Street just before dusk, the sky low and yellow with the promise of rain. Holmes sat silently across from me in the hansom, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. He had not spoken since we left Lambeth, not even to comment on the disturbing drawings or the diary's final passage. In 2-1B, Mrs. Hudson brought in tea, which Holmes ignored. Instead, he rose, unlocked his desk drawer, and withdrew a thick brown envelope. From it, he produced a small collection of pressed paper, letters, notes, and one crisp photograph. Dotted was a portrait of the Countess Aliska Daubeny, seated on a chaise in her younger years. Holmes studied it for a long time, then handed it to me. Looked closely at her eyes. Watson. I peered at the photograph. Her gaze was direct, perhaps even challenging, but something about it struck me as familiar, some hint of fear tightly masked behind elegance. She knows something, I said. She remembers something, Holmes corrected. She was once a patroness of Reverend Crowell's orphanage. Charity galas, fundraisers, letters of endorsement. Her name appears in the guest ledgers from 1871 through 75. Not frequent, but consistent. And you believe she knew about Mute Will? I believe she knew of him, Holmes replied. More importantly, I believe he knows her. That is why she recoiled from the Hatbox, not from the atrocity but from the memory it unearthed. I nodded. Then what do we do? Holmes stood and paced toward the fireplace. We light the candle in the dark. Watson, we draw him out not by chasing him, but by reminding him we remember too. He turned to me, eyes glittering. I will write the Countess a letter, a false one, from the hand of someone who ought to be long dead. We shall offer her a name, William Ashgrove. We shall say he is alive, that he seeks reconciliation, that he remembers everything and is coming to speak. I blinked. You intend to provoke her? No, Holmes said softly. I intend to provoke him. If our assailant truly is Mute Will or someone who identifies with him, then such a letter will send a tremor through whatever nest he hides in. He will strike again, Watson, but this time, with purpose, desperation. He retrieved his pen and inkwell, and began writing with methodical precision. I watched in silence as the letter took shape. Madam, we have never spoken, but you once looked at me through glass and smiled, though I had no teeth to return the favor. I remember you now. I remember the hall, the whispers, the blood in the basin. I remember him. I am coming to speak to you not in anger, but in truth. You will know me when I arrive. W.A. Holmes blotted the ink, sealed the letter in a plain envelope, and addressed it by hand. She will receive this by morning, he said, and so will he. I frowned. You believe he watches her? I believe he watches everyone who ever stood above him, Holmes murmured. He is not simply killing, he is building a stage. The next morning, Holmes had the letter delivered by a street urchin from his network. The Countess, we were told, was in residence at her Kensington home, having cancelled all her appointments since our visit. Holmes then instructed Wiggins, his most trusted boy, to linger near the house, observing anyone who approached or followed. We returned to Baker Street to wait. Holmes occupied himself with a violin concerto that sounded more like a while I tried, in vain, to distract myself with the Times, but my attention wandered continually to the shadows outside the window, the sound of passing footsteps on the stairs, and the memory of those haunting sketches from Crowell's room. At precisely 10 minutes past 4, there came a knock. Wiggins entered, his face pale beneath the soot. She got the letter, he said. Read it right there in the drawing room. But she didn't burn it, didn't throw it away. She locked it in a little box and rang for the butler. Does anyone follow her? Holmes asked. Wiggins hesitated. That's just it, sir. There was a man, watching from across the street. Tall bloke, shabby coat, didn't move even when I walked past twice. Holmes's face darkened with grim satisfaction. He's heard the signal. The trap is set. And what now? I asked. Now, Holmes said, rising and taking up his revolver. We wait for the next tooth to fall. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The morning air was thick with a dull drizzle when Holmes roused me from my chair by the fire. He had not slept. I was certain of it. His collar remained crumpled, his hair in slight disarray, but his eyes gleamed with that unmistakable sharpness that only emerged when a puzzle turned just so in his mind. It is time, Watson, he said quietly, brushing past me to gather his coat and walking stick. The stage is set. The players are waking. Come, where are we headed? Kensington, Holmes said, already halfway down the stairs. There is something the Countess has not yet confessed in someone who cannot allow her the chance. Outside, the sky hung low and grey, threatening heavier rain. We took a cab to the Countess's estate. The horses' hooves muffled against the damp cobblestones. Holmes said little on the journey, save for a muttered observation about ritual repetition and the cruelty of memory. When we arrived at the wrought iron gate, a constable was already stationed there, flanked by a pair of startled footmen. Holmes flashed his card, and we were granted swift entry. Inside, the Countess d'Orbigny stood in the foyer, wrapped in a dark green dressing gown, her face pale but composed. In her hands, she held the envelope Holmes had sent. I thought it was a cruel jest, she said, her voice trembling beneath practiced grace. But now I feel eyes in every mirror. Holmes gave a short bow. Madam, your fear is justified. Someone from your past, someone long presumed buried, has emerged with a singular purpose. Tell me plainly, what did you see at the orphanage? She hesitated. Her fingers clenched the envelope tighter. I was young, she began, her tone distant, as though reciting a dream. I visited as part of a church committee. Once a month, I brought donations, clothes, books. Most of the children were dullied, polite, but there was one boy, ... double quotes William Ashgrove, Holmes said. She nodded. Yes, he never spoke, but his eyes soared. Those eyes haunted me. One afternoon, I caught Reverend He had the boy by the collar, dragging him into the cellar. The boy was fighting soundlessly but with all his strength. Her voice cracked. I told the matron. She told me never to return. Holmes paced a slow circle around her. And you didn't. I sent a letter, anonymously, to the local council. I hoped it would be enough. But it wasn't, Holmes said. No, she whispered. It wasn't. Holmes turned away, his fingers tapping his lips. The Countess looked at me, and I saw in her gaze, not guilt, but shame. It was then that the housekeeper entered, her face ashen. Inspector Lestrade is here. Sand. There's been another message. Holmes stiffened. Where? The garden wall, scrawled in chalk. We followed her through the conservatory, and out into the narrow-hedged garden, the air now laced with fine rain. There, on the brick wall nearest the street, a message was etched in trembling white strokes. You remember now. That is enough. Holmes stared at the words for a long moment, then knelt to inspect the chalk. He touched it lightly, sniffed his fingers, and smiled faintly. Not chalk, he murmured. Gypsum mixed with bone ash. He wants us to know it's him. Lestrade joined us then, pulling his coat tighter against the rain. Another madman's taunt, he said gruffly. I've half a mind to put a man on every corner. Do so, Holmes said, but do not engage. He is not taunting. He is calculating. He wants to know how far the Countess remembers. He is circling before he strikes. And you, Holmes, do you know who it is? Holmes turned slowly, his gaze settling on the faint message once more. He did not speak at first, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A realization, dawning like light beneath storm clouds. I know, he said finally. Not yet the name, but the pattern. He turned to me then, and in his eyes I saw something rare, something bordering on sorrow. This is not vengeance, Watson. It is a reclamation. And with that, he strode back into the house, leaving us to stare at the rain-washed wall and the faint ghost of the name that would soon be spoken. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. Night returned to Baker Street like a shadowed visitor, silent, slow, and impossible to ignore. Holmes had taken to the armchair, his steepled fingers pressed to his lips, and the faint glow of the fire rendered his features as if carved in thoughtful marble. I knew better than to interrupt when he was in this state, but the tension in the air had grown unbearable. Finally, he stirred. He will not wait much longer, Watson, he said quietly. The Countess's partial recollection has shaken him. He fears the rest will follow. You believe he'll strike again? Holmes nodded. Yes, but not to kill. Not yet. Not unless he's cornered. He is not like Moriarty, driven by conquest, or Moran, by cruelty. No, this man believes himself justified. Each step he takes is measured, even theatrical. His crimes are not merely punishment, they are reminders. Reminders of what? Holmes stood abruptly, of what was done to him, and by whom. Before I could press further, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, looking alarmed. There's a young woman, Mr. Holmes, quite distressed. Says she must speak with you at once. Holmes beckoned her in. The girl, no older than 20, had auburn curls damp from the drizzle and eyes rimmed red. She clutched a small parcel wrapped in waxed cloth. I'm sorry, she stammered. I didn't know where else to go. I work at the South Bank Theatre. This was left at our backstage door not an hour ago. A man in a dark coat, he just vanished into the fog. Holmes accepted the parcel without a word. He placed it on the table and unwrapped it with delicate care. Inside was a theatre program, yellowed, from nearly 2 decades prior. Folded inside was a single, blood-stained glove, and written across the cover in smudged ink were the words, "The Countess wears a mask. Tonight, I will remove it." Holmes's jaw tightened. Theatre as metaphor, he murmured. He plans to unmask her publicly, and without mercy. But what theatre? I asked. There is only one production in London tonight, tied to the Daubeny name, he replied, already moving to the coat stand. The Royal Belvedere, a charity performance for war widows, and the Countess is the guest of honor. We arrived at the Belvedere amidst a swirl of carriages and silk umbrellas. The Grand Marquis shimmered in the gaslight, and the sound of string music floated through the open doors. Holmes moved with urgency, but not panic, a panther, stalking through a maze of velvet and stone. Inside, he spoke briefly with the theatre manager, who blanched upon hearing the name Daubeny. Within minutes, we were granted access to the side corridors and dressing areas. She's in the royal box, the manager whispered. Arrived just before you. With Lord Greywater. Holmes paused. Greywater, a cousin, I believe. On her late husband's side. Holmes gave no reply, only quickened his pace, as we ascended the private stairway to the royal box. The lights in the theatre dimmed, and the overture began. Holmes pressed his ear to the door of the private balcony chamber. I could hear only the soft rise of orchestral strings, but Holmes's eyes had narrowed. He opened the door slowly. The Countess sat alone in the ornate chamber, her face composed but alert. A silver opera glass trembled slightly in her hands. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "I thought, where is Lord Grey?" Holmes asked sharply. She frowned. "He left only moments ago. Said he had forgotten something in the carriage." Holmes turned on his heel. "Watson, with me." We reached the foyer just as a figure in a dark frock coat slipped out through the staff exit. Holmes moved like a shadow, cutting across the marbled floor with astonishing speed. He called, "A word, if you please." The figure paused and bolted. We followed, down the alley, past crates and puddles, and a scattering of startled cats. The man was fast, but not fast enough. Holmes's cane swept out, hooking the man's foot, and he crashed to the ground on the gaslight. His face was not that of Greywater. Holmes pulled off the false beard and spectacles, revealing a hollow-cheeked man with wild, searching eyes. "William Ashgrove," Holmes said softly, "I was beginning to wonder if you existed at all." The man looked at Holmes as one might a priest, or perhaps an executioner. "I only wanted her to see," he whispered. "To remember, that's all." Holmes didn't reply. He simply stood there, solemn as a judge, while the theatre manager and a constable, summoned moments earlier, arrived to take the man into custody. As they led him away, Ashgrove turned and spoke one final time. "She wore perfume," he said. Even then, in that terrible place, Holmes watched until the man disappeared into the fog. Then quietly he said, "This is not over." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in the final clue. Revealed the moon was high over Baker Street by the time we returned. Holmes had barely spoken during the cab ride, his gaze locked on the passing gas lamps, the rhythm of their glow seeming to mark off thoughts too complex to utter aloud. The capture of William Ashgrove might have satisfied the police and even the Countess herself, but I could sense in Holmes a mounting uneasy awareness that the solution we had uncovered was only a layer of a much deeper design. He strode immediately to the mantelpiece, retrieving the hatbox once again from its perch beside the hearth. The teeth within ghastly even under daylights, even more grotesque in the flickering firelight. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice flat and low, "there is something very wrong here. Ashgrove did not commit the murder." I blinked, but he ran. Holmes, he delivered the note. He matched the physical description. Yes, but all of that only confirms he is involved. Not guilty. Holmes turned toward me, eyes gleaming. "Ashgrove is the messenger. He has borne the burden of remembrance, but not of violence." "Then who?" Holmes raised a finger. "The teeth," he murmured, lifting the lid of the box again. "Too many for one mouth, wouldn't you say?" I stepped closer. Yes, now that you mention it, there are 32 adult teeth in a typical mouth," Holmes continued. "This box contains and not all from the same skull." I stared at the box anew, chilled. I had my suspicions when I examined them closely. Variations in root formation, degree of wear, and even the faint stains left behind by differing diets. These teeth are trophies, Watson, gathered over time. Good heavens, then the victim is but the most recent, Holmes replied, and likely not the first. A silence fell. My thoughts spun, grasping for coherence. Holmes continued, more to himself than to me. The first death was merely the tipping point. The hatbox was no random gesture of madness. It was a calling card, a calculated symbol meant for one particular set of eyes. The Countess, he nodded, and it worked. "Did you hear what Ashgrove said when they took him?" I nodded slowly. "She wore perfume, even then." Holmes turned from the fire and began pacing. The phrase struck me. I've heard it's like before, many years ago, during a conversation with Inspector Trevor about the Mortlake Asylum fire. "Good Lord, that was ages past," I said. 4 or 5 died, didn't they? 7, Holmes corrected. 7 unrecorded deaths, all presumed patients, but the records were destroyed in the blaze. No names, no family claims, and most important, no autopsies. I stared at him. "You'd think these teeth ... double quotes, were collected from the victims." "Yes." He pulled a folder from the stack by his desk and opened it, revealing a charred ledger, barely legible. "I acquired this from Scotland Yard years ago, as part of another inquiry. Note this entry here, dated April 14th, 1874, just days before the fire." I peered at the faded script. "Ashgrove, William, disorder, melancholia with delusions. Treatment, theatre-based role, immersion." Holmes tapped the line beneath ITA Daubeny. "Visitor, treatment sponsor, Amanda Daubeny," I whispered. "The same," Holmes said grimly. "She wasn't always a countess. Back then, she was an heiress dabbling in progressive psychiatric therapies. The patients were her stage Ashgrove, her leading man. But what happened? Ashgrove fell in love with her, or rather, with the role she played, and when she left, when the project was shut down, he remained behind, abandoned. It broke him. I believe he witnessed the deaths, possibly even survived the fire, and the Countess never acknowledged it." Holmes looked weary. "It seems she moved on, married, rose through society. She wore perfume, Watson, even in that terrible place. Ashgrove remembered, but someone else remembered too. Someone who wanted revenge not only on her but on all those who benefited from forgetting. The killer. Holmes nodded. Yes, and here is the final clue. He drew a small envelope from the coat he had worn to the theater and handed it to me. I opened it to find a folded program from the Belvedere's performance that evening. Scribbled inside were 4 names, all seated in the Countess's box, all connected by past investment in the Mortlake project. Except one. Greywater, I said aloud. Holmes smiled coldly. No such person exists. He was invented, conjured up to give our killer access. And I believe we'll find that each of those names was recently contacted by this cousin. He reached for his coat again. It's time to bring them all together, Watson. The final act approaches, and the curtain must rise on truth. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The next evening found us in a private salon at the Langham Hotel, a grand and discreet establishment Holmes often preferred for delicate affairs. The room had been arranged under a false name, Mr. Greywater. Ironically, under it sat 5 people, each restless, each darting occasional glances toward the others as if the walls themselves bore witness. The Countess Amanda Daubeny arrived last, swathed in a velvet cloak, the color of dried blood. She nodded briskly to the group, her eyes betraying the faintest flicker of uncertainty, before settling on Holmes. He stood at the center, tall and grave. I, seated in the corner, kept my notebook open, but wrote nothing. My attention was wholly fixed on the storm gathering in that room. I thank you all for accepting this invitation under such short notice, Holmes began, his voice clear but free of theatrics. I regret the unusual method, but it was necessary for your safety, and, more importantly, for the truth. Mr. Holmes, began a thin-lipped gentleman with a monocle, Sir Godfrey Thane, a financier and patron of the arts. What is the meaning of this? I was told my cousin Greywater had arrived from Vienna. There is no cousin Greywater, Holmes replied, nor has there ever been. The identity was fabricated by someone wishing to lure you together into one place, under one roof. Murmurs circled the room. Lady Fenchurch, a plump, perfumed widow with trembling hands, clutched her handkerchief as though it might turn into a rope. Lurer, she whispered. For what purpose, sir? Demanded a sharper gentleman in his middle years. Colonel Bradstone, recently retired from the colonial service. For judgment, Holmes said quietly, and perhaps vengeance. The Countess stood, her voice calm but firm. This is ridiculous. We have done nothing to merit such insinuation. We are not criminals. Holmes inclined his head. That is not my accusation, madam. I merely wish to understand the full nature of your connection to the Mortlake project. A hush fell, broken only by the creak of Sir Godfrey's chair. I funded it, he muttered. A foolish diversion in my youth. We believed well Amanda here said that theatre could soothe the minds of the disturbed. Lady Fenchurch nodded. We were promised a kind of enlightenment, humanism, grace for the broken. Bradstone scoffed. It was a farce. The inmates were nothing more than actors in a pantomime. Ashgrove in particular, he thought it all real. He loved me, said the Countess suddenly, and all eyes turned to her. That is the truth. I wore a costume, played a part, but he believed it, and I left without saying goodbye. There was silence, and the fire. Holmes asked. No one ever proved it wasn't an accident, she replied. The records perished. Yes, but by then the project had been shuttered, but not forgotten, Holmes said. Ashgrove remembered, and someone else remembered as well. Someone who believes you all are responsible for what happened inside those walls. Sir Godfrey scoffed. Responsible for what? Precisely. The deaths, the madness. We played no direct role. Perhaps not, Holmes said. But guilt is a subjective noose. It tightens by the hand of the one who believes it justified. At that moment, there came a knock on the door. I stood instinctively, but Holmes motioned for me to stay seated. He walked to the door himself and opened it just slightly. Lestrade entered, quiet and professional, followed by 2 constables. Behind them, half shielded in shadow, was the hunched form of William Ashgrove. Gasps broke out. Lady Fenchurch recoiled, and even the colonel rose to his feet in alarm. Ashgrove said nothing. His eyes roved across the faces in the room, stopping at last on the Countess. She stared at him, face pale, and did not speak. Holmes stepped forward. Mr. Ashgrove has made a statement, one that I believe brings us closer to the true nature of the crimes. But before I reveal what we've learned, I need one more piece of the puzzle, and I believe that piece will reveal itself tonight. He gestured to the constables. No one is to leave this room until the conclusion. "You are all under protective watch," Lady Fenchurch whimpered. Bradstone looked ready to draw a saber from thin air, but none protested. Holmes turned to me, his voice low. "Watch their faces, Watson. One among them carries the weight of far more than guilt." The trap was set. The players were in place, and whatever spirit of vengeance had begun this dark theatre, it would not wait long to take the stage. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime. Holmes stood before the assembled guests like a maestro poised to conduct the final movement of a troubled symphony. The air inside the Langham salon was tense, thick with unspoken accusations and sharpened memories. Even Lestrade seemed subdued, keeping to the back wall with folded arms and narrowed eyes. Holmes cleared his throat gently, then spoke with quiet authority. "This is not merely a case of murder or madness," he began. "It is a question of memory, of ghosts unburied and sins unspoken." Lady Fenchurch fidgeted, her silk gloves creaking. Colonel Bradstone sipped from a glass of water, as if it might cleanse him of past regrets. Sir Godfrey, lips pinched, studied Holmes like a chessboard he no longer understood, and the Countess did not move. She watched Holmes with the unblinking gaze of one awaiting sentence. Holmes turned to Ashgrove, who stood near the door with Lestrade. His face bore no anger, only the blank serenity of a man whose storm had already passed. William Ashgrove, once a stage actor of fine reputation, was drawn into the Mortlake experimenter project that promised art as a bomb for the insane. You five were its benefactors, its designers, its performers, and while the project collapsed under its own contradictions, it left Ashgrove broken. But he was not the only casualty. Holmes drew from his coat a photograph, yellowed and water-damaged. He held it up for all to see. "This is Margaret Ilwell," he said, "a nurse at Mortlake, gentle, quiet, and in love with Ashgrove. She was his anchor, his reality." "Margaret," Lady Fenchurch whispered. "She died in the fire." Holmes continued, "Not as a patient, but trying to save Ashgrove, who had been sedated after a violent outburst. She perished when the east wing collapsed." Holmes stepped forward, placing the photo on the table. For years, Ashgrove believed he had killed her. His fragmented memories twisted the truth into guilt, until someone recently reminded him otherwise. Someone who visited him in secret, stoked his pain, and manipulated his grief. Sir Godfrey stood abruptly. "You're not saying "No," Holmes interrupted, calm but firm. "Ashgrove may have visited the scene of one death, but he is not the orchestrator of this campaign." He let the silence build, then turned his eyes to the Countess. "No, that honor belongs to someone far more calculated. Amanda Daubeny." He held his gaze, unflinching. "Do say it plainly, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped closer. "You disappeared after change your name, moved through Europe. You resurfaced recently in Paris, right around the time someone began sending anonymous letters to Ashgrove. Letters with the Mortlake seal." A flicker crossed her expression, just enough to register. "You played a part so well, Countess, that even you forgot where the character ended and the truth began. You toyed with a madman's mind, not to seek justice, but to preserve your secrets." She laughed softly, though it rang hollow. "You have no proof of this melodrama." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, not proof yet, but the most damning evidence is not in handwriting or witnesses. It is in contradiction." He turned to the group. "When asked about Mortlake's final performance, each of you described a different scene, different lines, different actors. Only one person claimed to remember all of it with clarity, because she wrote it." He faced the Countess again. "You sent Ashgrove those letters. You convinced him they were from Margaret. You led him back to the world, and you used him to frighten and punish those who might reveal your past." Lady Fenchurch looked near collapsing. "But why? What purpose could that serve?" "Because," Holmes said gently, "the fire was not an accident. It was staged, to erase the evidence of what Mortlake had become, a playground for wealthy guilt, dressed in theatrical compassion." The room fell into stunned silence. "And Margaret," whispered Colonel Bradstone. Holmes turned to Ashgrove, who finally spoke. "She tried to save me," he said, voice hoarse, "but someone locked the wing from outside." Holmes gave a small, sad nod. Ashgrove was framed for the fire, his madness used as a shield. He looked once more to Amanda Daubeny. "You did not light the match, but you watched it burn." Her eyes shimmered with restrained emotion, but still, she said nothing. Lestrade finally stepped forward. "That's quite a tale, Holmes. But what now?" Holmes closed his hands behind his back. "Now," he said, "we await the final move. For the game, my dear Lestrade, is not yet over. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The salon was still heavy with silence, as if the walls themselves held their breath in the wake of Holmes' revelation. No one moved. Even Lestrade, usually quick to act, stood with one hand hovering near his notebook, uncertain whether the moment called for arrest or reckoning. Amanda Daubeny, countess or actress, villain or victim, sat down at last. Her elegant frame slumped, not in defeat, but in release. The exhaustion of secrets long carried had finally taken its toll. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said softly, more to herself than to the room. "I only wanted the truth remembered." Holmes inclined his head, his voice calm. "Yet you buried it beneath deception. In seeking to avenge Margaret, you became a reflection of the very cruelty you fled." The Countess looked up sharply. "You don't understand what Mortlake was. They called it therapy, but it was theatre. You should have seen the rehearsals, noblemen playing madmen playing themselves. Margaret saw it for what it was. They punished her for that." Lestrade finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Well, regardless of intent, we've got enough here for a magistrate to chew on. Interfering with a criminal investigation, conspiracy, possibly more." "No," Holmes said, without raising his voice. "There will be no formal charges." Lestrade blinked. "No charges. Miss Daubeny's actions, however misguided, brought to light a crime long buried. Scotland Yard failed. Mortlake, once we mustn't fail again in understanding how deeply the system allowed its horrors." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "And what about Ashgrove? He broke into a home, threatened witnesses, and may have caused a man's death." Holmes glanced at the actor, who stood like a pale wraith, eyes fixed on the fire. The man who entered Sir Godfrey's estate was not William Ashgrove, but the fractured memory of a man who once trusted the world. He has been used, not as a villain, but as a weapon. Sir Godfrey stirred from his corner. "So what becomes of us? Must we all stand trial in public for what happened in that asylum?" "No," Holmes said again, more gently this time. "But you must live with the truth now. Each of you played a part, some in silence, some in arrogance, and others in shame." Colonel Bradstone spoke for the first time, his voice tight. "What if we try to make it right?" Holmes raised a brow. "By confessing to a fire the public has forgotten? Perhaps not, but Mortlake's legacy still lives in the minds of the broken it left behind. Use your influence to help them, quietly, without theatre this time." Lady Fenchurch dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "And he will need care," Holmes said. "Proper care, and peace." Holmes turned back to Lestrade. "You can report the death at the river as an accident, which it likely was. You'll find no poison in Sir Godfrey's system, only the shock of seeing his past unmasked." Lestrade muttered. "I've written stranger reports." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed you have." The Countess rose once more, her poise returning. "And me? You'll leave London tonight. I recommend Vienna, or someplace quiet and unremarkable." She looked at Holmes with something like gratitude. "You're kinder than you let on." He tilted his head. "I merely believe in endings." She stepped past him, pausing at the door. To Watson, she gave a subtle nod, more acknowledgement than farewell, and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Ashgrove followed, silent and shadow-like, escorted gently by Lestrade's men, who had been standing just outside. The others dispersed slowly. Colonel Bradstone first, then Lady Fenchurch. Only Sir Godfrey lingered at the window, staring out at the grey fog beyond. Watson stepped beside Holmes. "Will you write about this case?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "I suspect not. Some stories are better suited for the stage than the page." Watson chuckled dryly. "And yet you orchestrated the entire performance." Holmes reached for his coat. "A performance, my dear Watson, is only as honest as the audience allows it to be." With that, he turned toward the door. Chapter 18. Holmes. Final reflections. Some weeks passed before I set pen to paper on the matter of the Hatbox. London turned from wet chill to a brittle, uncertain spring. Hansoms splashed through thawing gutters, and the newspapers, having briefly toyed with rumors of aristocratic derangement, found richer scandals elsewhere. Thus ended, for the public at least, a case that had brushed the outer hems of horror without ever quite stepping fully into the gallows light of murder. For us, however, the echoes lingered. Ashgrove was placed, and with Holmes's urging, not in a prison ward, but in a convalescent home attached to St. Bartholomew's, under proper care. He showed intervals of lucidity, In one such hour, he told Holmes that the teeth were never trophies of killing, but Marcus tokens gathered over years from charity hospitals, dental schools, and paupers' lots, chosen to stand in for those whose real remains were lost in the Mortlake fire. If they will not mark the dead, he said, I will give them new mouths to speak. That, I think, was the truest thing he ever uttered. Lestrade at length identified the jaw sent to Camden Mortuary as belonging to an unidentified Thames recovery, likely a river-drowned labourer, dead some days before his jaw was removed. The mutilation occurred after death. Someone, almost certainly Ashgrove under direction, harvested the fragment for dramatic effect. No murder was provable. Scotland Yard, not keen to prosecute a scandal that would soil more uniforms than aprons, accepted the ruling. Officially, no foul play established. Privately, Holmes handled it. As for the Countess Amanda Daubeny, she did leave England. A brief notice in the society columns placed her in Trieste for health. Holmes received a single letter from her 3 months later. It contained no apology, no confession, only a pressed sprig of lavender, and the line, I visited the graves. There were none. I have set 3. Holmes burned the letter unread by others. Sir Godfrey, Lady Fe, and Colonel Bradstone established under a discreet charitable trust a fund for the long-term treatment of indigent patients removed from shuttered private Holmes made no comment, but I caught him one evening turning the prospectus over in his hands with a look that was not displeasure, and the hat. It rests still, at least as of this writing, upon the upper shelf of a locked cabinet at Baker Street, the teeth individually wrapped, catalogued, and marked not by number, but by absence, child, unrecorded, unknown nurse, Mortlake, symbolic. Holmes would not allow them to be buried. Symbols, he said, are evidence in cases the law refuses to try. It was on a quiet afternoon in late March that I pressed him, at last, for his summation. He had been rearranging chemical slides when I spoke. Holmes, I cannot help but feel we ended in vapor. No charge, no verdict, nobody truly tied to crime. What, in the end, was the case? He did not look up at once. Then he smiled, thin, sideways, fond. My dear Watson, the law concerns itself with acts. I, at times, must concern myself with consequences. A deed may call, a memory never does. Mortlake burned years ago, but its heat remained in those who escaped it. One tried to forget, one tried to be forgiven, one tried to remind the others by any instrument, to hand teeth, letters, boxes, fear. I merely prevented memory from producing fresh bodies, and the guilt, I asked, distributed, he said. Like dental ware, no single tooth bears the bite alone. He set down his slides and turned toward the window, where weak light traced the edges of the London fog. You see, Watson, we are told to separate fact from feeling, yet the world rarely obliges. The Countess did not kill. Still, she harmed. Ashgrove did not murder. Still, he frightened the innocent. Lestrade did not err. Still, the Yard forgot the poor. Justice, when it comes at all, is a composite like a jaw built from borrowed bone. Imperfect, but serviceable. He paused, then added almost lightly, besides, I detest unshelved puzzles. That evening, as I prepared to depart, I glanced once more at the locked cabinet. From within, wrapped in linen and velvet, lay the mute relics of a tragedy performed in 3 acts. Charity, experiment, forgetting. Holmes, sensing my look, said only, leave them, Watson. They have spoken, and so ends the affair of the Hatbox full of teeth, a case without a corpse, a crime without a verdict, and yet one of the most human tragedies I have ever witnessed in the company of Sherlock Holmes. Should history choose to forget, let this account stand as its enamel, thin perhaps, but enduring.